This is the Pioneer GrowingPoint Agronomy Podcast.
Welcome to the podcast that talks everything agronomy and only agronomy, tackling current agronomy topics, management strategies, and answering questions submitted from our listeners.
On this episode, we will cover considerations around sulfur management.
And now your hosts, DuPont Pioneer field agronomists Josh Shofner and Brian Buck.
All right, Josh, so our topic for today is sulfur management. So to get started, I think it would be good, could you outline some of the history of sulfur management and just historically where it's been for corn production?
Yeah, Brian, and you and I are both kind of younger agronomists, so we've kind of went through kind of the transition of sulfur management. And really, you know, when I first got into the business of consulting growers on crop nutrition, sulfur was, I'd call it was still kind of a micro or secondary nutrient where we were maybe applying in that 10 to 15 pounds per acre for a corn crop. Where now, we're talking about double, if not almost triple that, the rates that we're applying to corn. So it's changed quite a bit, and really, no secret, don't want to spend a lot of time of the reasons why. Big reasons are we used to have a lot of sulfur components within fertilizers as they were manufactured, and the other reason is we're not receiving as much sulfur as a result of pollution and acidic rain and things like that from the atmosphere. So it's changed a lot, and it's something that we still run into. Some growers have adapted to that change relatively quick and have a good sulfur program, where some are still quite a bit short on sulfur, and we try to address that every year with these growers.
Yeah, it's really a compounding factor. When you look at it, we used to have a lot more supplied sulfur, like you said, between those fertilizers, but also that deposition was significantly more, 2 to 3 times more 30 years ago. But the other piece of that, too, is, crop production in general. We've really, raised the mark on total bushels we're pulling off, which makes, the amount we need quite a bit higher, just like P and K or even nitrogen. So, looking at sulfur, getting into it, I think you hit a little bit there already. A lot of guys are in that 10 to 15 pound range, and now they're into that 20, 25, even some into the 30 pound range. One thing to consider when you start thinking sulfur, though, is what are the different forms out there, Josh, that you can get to apply on your crop to supply it?
Well, the two main forms that we're going to run into is the sulfate form, which probably the most common form of sulfur that we apply in the upper Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa. The other main form that we use up here is in the elemental form. Both very different. The sulfate form, I usually when I talk sulfate sulfur, I usually compare that to like nitrogen. It comes available relatively quick after application. It moves in water solution. It can leach like nitrogen. Sulfate sulfur is nice because when we apply it, we know it's going to come available for us. We know it's going to be there. On the flip side, on the elemental sulfur side, it takes a long time for that product to oxidize and become available in a sulfate form. In most cases, especially this far north where we have, some cold and frozen soils through the part of the year, probably that 8 to 15, 18 months is what it's going to take to get an application of elemental sulfur fully available in a plant, basically available to a plant.
Yeah, so when you're really looking at it, so timing of application, I think, is the main key there. So you talked about the sulfate sulfur being readily available and also leachable, similar to nitrogen. So if you're applying a sulfate sulfur like ammonium sulfate or ammonium thiosulfate, which would be a liquid, you really have to get that on in the spring, not in the fall, or you risk pretty good chance of that leaching out. Where the elemental sulfur, I think, where it's become a bigger play is in the anhydrous acres, where it's fall P and K, fall anhydrous. So, they're not spreading anything in the spring, so they tend to put that elemental sulfur out in the fall.
Yeah, and both strategies, work fine, and we'll get into the strategies here of really how to manage this the best, but those are the biggest things. When we talk about the two forms, I think the two things I want to remember. Number one, we really don't want to be applying sulfate sulfur in the fall. As we mentioned, it can leach, and with the cost of fertilizer today and what the corn prices are, we just can't risk making applications where we're having potentially 10, 15, 20, 30% of it that we're going to lose from leaching, and that's really important. And that's where elemental fits those anhydrous acres or a fall P&K program really well, where you're not making a bulk spread application in the spring, or in a situation where you don't have 2x2 starter and ammonium thiosulfate isn't an option for you from a planter standpoint. So backing up, Brian, let's talk a little bit about, what's a good way to grade, hey, is my sulfur program working? Do I have enough sulfur out there? And I think the best way is to determine if your sulfur program is working is walking your fields at knee-high corn and looking for deficiency symptoms. What do we want to look for at that time, Brian?
Yeah, when you start looking, I start to see a lot of them, that 2 to 3 leaf stage, you'll start to see a little bit of sulfur deficiency, but especially once it hits that rapid growth stage where it extends to knee high, you start to see a lot more. What I'm looking for is the yellowing of the plants and also kind of the interveinal chlorosis. So you kind of see the plants will kind of have a little bit of a striped look to them, but just kind of that pale yellow, not quite there. I think it's often confused with nitrogen deficiency, and I think it's put off as that in a lot of situations where people assume it's that. But often it is sulfur, and you can tissue test, but also just really looking at those visual symptoms. A lot of the books have very great pictures just to compare to, but that interveinal chlorosis and just that general yellowing is a key sign.
All really good, valid points there, Brian. Brian, you mentioned a little bit about tissue testing for sulfur, and that is a really good way to gauge some of your sulfur deficiencies or how your sulfur program is working out. What about soil testing, Brian? We talk about, crop nutrition. We always talk about the importance of soil sampling. Is that a viable option for sulfur?
So soil testing, when you look at it, historically P and K we've soil tested for, applied for, really good tests in general. When it comes to sulfur, the inorganic S test isn't as reliable. So in general, most people don't go to a soil test for sulfur at all. I mentioned tissue testing. The one tough thing about tissue testing is usually you're going to find out if you're deficient after the fact because you saw a deficiency in the field. So really planning ahead for sulfur is about making sure you have enough out there for crop removal of what the crop you have out. And the testing isn't probably quite as accurate or used as much for sulfur as it is in like P and K. Josh, so far we've talked about different forms of sulfur, identifying sulfur deficiency symptoms in the field, and also just discussed around sampling and what that means with sulfur. So, we've hit on that, but really looking forward, what really matters to growers, I think, is, what impact does it have on yield and how much does it generally cost? So if you could hit a little on that, I think that'd be great.
Yeah, so in corn, sulfur is so important, and really to really understand how serious sulfur is in corn is really you can't plant corn without applying nitrogen, and if you believe in that, then you can't plant corn without applying the right amount of sulfur, and that's how big the yield impacts can be. Every year, Brian, I get called on roughly 5 to 6 service calls where maybe the yields are off or the corn's looking a little bit off, but usually these calls come at harvest time where they're just not getting the yield that they're looking for, and maybe the neighbor across the fence or some other farms are getting more. And in most cases, I get in the combine and we're riding around and the monitor just won't go over 175 or 80 bushel. And, Brian, every time we make those rounds and you start playing 20 questions and asking them kind of everything that's happened from planting till now. And so many times it boils down to sulfur. You ask them, how many pounds am I applying? In some cases in rare cases, I do run into some guys that are applying no sulfur, but in most cases they're only applying 10 to 15 pounds at the most. And if you want to raise 200 bushel corn or 220 bushel corn in southern Minnesota, which we can do when the weather cooperates, that's just not enough sulfur to do it. And especially where we do more corn on corn, Brian, the southeast Minnesota I-90 corridor has become such a big area of corn on corn. Yields have increased, that sulfur, requirement and applications have got to increase with it. And in most cases, we're just under applying. And really, Brian, we need to talk about how many pounds of sulfur do we need in a crop, and that's some things that we've done a lot of work with, and we've kind of changed our tone this summer based on some research that we did locally.
Yeah, so we had the chance to do some research locally, like you said, where we compared no sulfur to sulfur applied, primarily looked at corn on corn. So, historically, I think the rec has been that 15 to 20 pounds of sulfur. So we challenged that a little bit, and we moved that up to 30 pounds per acre of sulfur in our trial. So, comparing it visually, it was amazing. We had the 0 sulfur check right next to the 30-pound sulfur check with the same amount of nitrogen. And if you only saw the nitrogen only by itself, you wouldn't immediately say, hey, that has a sulfur problem from the front or from the road or walking the field. But once you see them side by side, you really know that it had a sulfur problem. They're about a foot different in height. And just overall plant health was quite a bit different, but it was really... it really catches your eye because, like I said, that corn next to it that was a foot shorter still held pretty good color. It just wasn't quite as big, wasn't quite as tall, wasn't quite as healthy. But in general, you didn't jump out and say, hey, that has a sulfur issue.
Yeah, when you get comparisons like that of no sulfur versus an application of 25 or 30 pounds, that yield impact is more than likely going to be in that 35 to 50 bushel range. In some cases, I have seen that go a little bit greater, but that's how many bushels of corn we're talking about of when you start talking about no sulfur to a good sulfur program. And the big thing, Brian, we've been planting a lot of 20 to 25 pounds, and it just seems like as we keep pushing that bar higher, we're getting a yield response. And in most cases, as a result of the amount of corn on corn acres we're doing, and as yields continue to rise in southeast Minnesota, we just feel like from you and I were doing a lot of 25-pound suggestions for a lot of years, and now in some cases, the nitrogen applications have increased just a little bit to support those kind of yield levels. The sulfur rate needs to go up with it, and in most cases, Brian, corn on corn, we suggest 30 pounds. Maybe there is an argument that do you need a full 30 pounds of sulfur on corn on soybeans? You and I have kind of agreed that we're just kind of at 30 pounds regardless of the crop rotation with sulfur demand for corn.
Yeah, historically, when you look at sulfur recs, you mentioned that they're the crop rotation. So corn on corn historically has had about a 5, sometimes even a 10-pound higher requirement or suggestion from a lot of the universities. When you look at it, another thing that factored into it historically was organic matter and texture of the soil. So areas up by like Hastings where it's a lot coarser soil have been applying, I think, quite a bit more sulfur, or at least they need to, just because of that leachability. But also there's just not quite as much supplied from the soil either, just similar to like a nitrogen type situation.
Okay, Brian, we've had some good discussion around the background of sulfur and the impacts of yield. Now I think the big question is, how do we get our sulfur applied? That kind of sounds like an easy question, but sometimes that is much easier said than done based on the current fertility program.
Yeah, so really, there's quite a few different approaches to fertility out in the countryside. So maybe start with the easier ones first. So if you're a urea spring applied guy with an airflow, it's pretty easy. You use ammonium sulfate, which is a dry granular. You can bulk spread it right with the urea, blend it in right with P&K, and get it out there in the spring with that product. It's going to be readily available. Put 100 to 125 pounds of product out, which will get you that 25 to 30 pounds of sulfur. The transitioning to a little tougher one, I'd say, or one of the toughest ones, is when there is no granular applied through an airflow or a spinner spreader in the spring. So the reason that's difficult is because you look at your ammonium sulfate, that's a dry granular that would be mixed in with those other ones. So in that situation, one of the solutions, and a lot of guys have went to, is applying ammonium thiosulfate, which is a liquid form of the sulfate sulfur, with the corn planter. Now, in order to do that, it needs to be 2x2 or 0x2, where it's 2 inches off to the side of the seed row and dripped on top, but it can't be on the seed. It needs to be 2 inches away from it. So that's a little bit more expensive program, but it's a good way to get out, sulfur right away there in the spring. The most difficult one, in my opinion, is when it's fall anhydrous, fall P&K, and you don't have the option to go to that on your planter. So that's where a lot of the elemental sulfurs come into play, because that's not as mobile as the sulfate form, but with that, it's also not as available as the sulfate form and can be a little bit inconsistent on its breakdown pattern. So I think the challenge is when guys put that out, elemental is not a bad product. It's just, is it going to be there and readily available for that crop to feed off of next spring? So the challenge in that situation is, I think I have to most guys, is try to get the units on your planter to put 0x2 or 2x2 amthio on with the planter to supplement the elemental sulfur. It's not that that's a bad program, but we really got to get some sulfate form in the mix.
Yeah, and the other option there, Brian, to consider if you are that fall anhydrous, fall P&K, is in some cases if you are maybe spraying your herbicide and using 28% as your carrier pre-emerge, that is a good way that you could actually spray ammonium thiosulfate over the top to look at that. And really, in that situation, your only other option, if you can't do it with the planter and you're not using elemental, is you're going to maybe have to look at a side dress application. And in some cases, growers, maybe they are doing fall anhydrous, but doing a side dress application with 28. If you can get that sulfur out there before V4, V5, it's not a bad way to get some sulfur applied out there as well. But it is really tough as we move west of Minnesota with fall anhydrous and fall P&K to really get the sulfur out there in the forms that we want, in the quantities that we want. And that's sometimes where I tend to run into the most sulfur deficiencies.
Yeah, and one other comment I'd make there, because it comes up a lot, guys in the elemental sulfur program will say, well, it's cheaper than ammonium sulfate. You just need to remember that ammonium sulfate is 21% nitrogen and 24% sulfur. So half the value in that ton is nitrogen, and you can cut back your nitrogen rate because of the nitrogen you're getting out of your AMS. So when you really back figure it, AMS is the cheapest form of sulfur out there. And I guess I just challenge you to really look at those real costs per unit of, the nutrient, because that nitrogen value should be accounted for.
Yeah, and elemental sulfur, it can be your primary sulfur and make it work. The challenge that we have, Brian, is sometimes, let's just say you're going to go into that program and you apply 30 pounds in the fall. That first year coming off that, it might not be enough, or you need supplemental. And then the other challenge of that is, if you're in a corn-soybean rotation or a 2-year corn, 1-year bean, what do you do about the fall ahead of the soybeans? Are you going to apply the sulfur, not apply, because that can really mess up your availability curves of when it's coming available if you have gaps in your applications.
Yeah, if you're going to go only elemental sulfur, it's got to be yearly applications and pretty consistent, just to make sure you can start to build up that breakdown over time. Another challenge of that becomes rented acres and acres that haven't been in your historic production, but that's probably a topic for another day.
Yeah. So in summary, it's really easy if you're a urea guy in the spring. AMS, put out that 30 pounds. It's a good way to do it. The other thing, Brian, is kind of if we had a choice of, hey, what's our Cadillac program, or what is the best way to do it, you and I have really bought into using the sulfate form with elemental form, and maybe looking at doing 20 or 25 pounds in the sulfate form in addition to maybe 5 to 10 pounds in the elemental form. And our big reason is late season availability, Brian.
Yeah, so that's a good opportunity where with your P&K, throw 10 pounds elemental sulfur out, 80 to 100 pounds of ammonium sulfate. You have a pretty good 1-2 punch there where, especially if you're on like a coarser soil, you maybe have a lot of rainfall or a pretty high leaching year, you still might have a little more available later, but a good 1-2 punch and kind of spreads out your breakdown pattern and availability.
Yeah, and if you're maybe thinking to yourself, why would I want to do that? The big reason is, if you look at historical tissue test results, if you look at tissue testing across a large area with many samples, is before, Brian, we started looking at elemental sulfur as an option, is we'd look at tissue testing when we got to tassel, we tend to start running deficient of sulfur, and our reason of pulling elemental in there was to have some sulfur applied that maybe isn't as leachable, may become available late season as the temperatures are at the warmest time of the year, breaking down to help bridge that gap to give us good available sulfur through grain fill, because sulfur uptake in grain fill is pretty high.
That was some interesting transition music. So, looking at
you might like that one.
Wrapping things up here for this week, looking at our crop shop tours coming up and where we're going to be speaking. Josh, what do you have on the calendar so far?
Well, I actually got started last week. I was down in Grand Meadow last Thursday, but upcoming dates, December 16th, I'll be in Austin in the morning, and then actually heading out to Keister, Minnesota the evening of December 16th. Middle of January, Brian, you will join me. Actually, we'll be in Lewiston, Minnesota, talking agronomy down there. And then late January, early February, don't got a date ironed down yet, but I will be in Caledonia. Probably, I think that's the longest running crop shop I got going down there. I think this will be the 5th season we've been down there for that one. Always a good crowd down there in Caledonia.
All right, so I have December 18th in Waseca. Then, like you said, I have the one in January with you. And then I also have one scheduled sometime the first week of February, it looks like, in the Claremont area. There'll be many more to come here as most of those get thrown on the calendar, usually at the end of December. So,
yeah, we got some good topics for the Winter Crop Shop Tour this year. I'm going to talk a lot about managing agronomy in relationship to return on investment and the commodity prices. So a lot of what we're going to talk about is going to come back down to dollars and cents, and really going through, hey, what things do we really got to focus on? Are there some areas to save? Where do we got to make sure we got the right stuff right? Sulfur is going to be one thing we talk about, Brian. We talked about it today, and we'll get into more economics when you come see us out on the road. But some really good topics we got developed.
Josh, that's a wrap for this week's podcast. This show is recorded from the Agronomy Bunker Studio in Zumbrota, Minnesota. It is produced by Brian Buck and Josh Shofner. This is a weekly podcast. Thanks for listening, and be sure to tune in next week.